In the luxurious room of the paralyzed tycoon, the nurse, a man from a modest neighborhood, felt the cold gaze of the wealthy butler as the man whispered something in the patient's ear. The tycoon's finger twitched as though he wanted to speak. The gathered family, haughty and aloof, shuddered at the movement, their silence betraying their unease. Michael Carter steadied his breathing, adjusting Mr. Hamilton's feeding tube with meticulous care. He pretended not to notice the scrutiny of Douglas, the butler, standing in the doorway with an expression carved from granite. The room was a strange hybrid of a hospital suite and a palatial bedroom, its heavy brocade curtains and ornate furnishings crowding in on Michael like silent accusers. A sleek monitor hummed nearby, incongruous against the backdrop of faded oil paintings and antique cabinetry. Michael's calloused hands moved deftly, his professional demeanor masking the tension tightening his chest. Mr. Hamilton lay motionless beneath pristine white sheets, his sunken eyes half-lidded but alive with a flicker of something. Desperation, perhaps. Douglas's stiff posture made Michael feel like an interloper, a sentiment reinforced by the sharpness in his voice. "Nurse Carter, I trust you're following the instructions provided." Michael straightened, his jaw tightening. Yes, of course. He kept his tone neutral, knowing full well any slip could cost him this position, a job he needed after months of financial hardship. But it wasn't just that. Something about Mr. Hamilton's condition gnawed at him, compelling him to stay. This was more than a paycheck, it was a matter of conscience. As Douglas adjusted the blanket with an almost ritualistic precision, Michael caught a flicker of movement. Mr. Hamilton's eyelids fluttered. Michael froze, his pulse quickening. Was it an involuntary reaction, or a deliberate attempt to communicate? A faint sound escaped the tycoon's throat, not quite a moan, but close. Michael leaned in, his heart hammering, only to have Douglas clear his throat loudly, breaking the moment. "Everything under control here?" Douglas asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "Absolutely," Michael replied curtly, withdrawing slightly. He couldn't afford to confront Douglas, not yet. He had no proof of anything. Just a growing suspicion that something was very, very wrong. Later, as Michael navigated the labyrinthine halls of the estate, he passed other staff members who barely acknowledged him. Rosa, a timid housekeeper, scurried past with her eyes averted. Outside, Thomas, the gardener, raked leaves with a mechanical rhythm, pausing only briefly to exchange a glance with Michael through the window. Their silence spoke volumes. This household was a prison, its inhabitants bound by invisible chains of fear. That night, as the mansion settled into an oppressive quiet, Michael's thoughts churned. Mr. Hamilton's flicker of awareness haunted him. Could the man be conscious, trapped within his own body? The family insisted he was in a persistent vegetative state, but Michael's experience told him otherwise. He had seen patients in similar conditions during his hospital training, and there was something different about Hamilton, something deliberate in his movements, however faint. Unable to sleep, Michael slipped back into Hamilton's room under the cover of darkness. The faint hum of medical equipment was the only sound. Michael's eyes darted to a locked cabinet on the far wall. Earlier, when Hamilton's hand had twitched, it had seemed to point in that direction. Michael knew he shouldn't, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. Crossing the room quietly, he examined the lock. Too sturdy to force without drawing attention. He'd have to bide his time. The next day, Michael's unease grew. Douglas was everywhere, his sharp eyes tracking Michael's every move. Meanwhile, the family lingered in the estate's opulent sitting room, their hushed conversations ceasing whenever Michael entered. The tension was suffocating. During his evening rounds, Michael noticed something odd in the medication log. Several entries didn't align with Mr. Hamilton's prescribed regimen. Subtle changes, but enough to raise alarm bells. One particular drug, unlabeled but present in the supply cabinet, caught his attention. Its pale yellow hue was unlike anything standard, and its viscosity suggested something far from ordinary. Determined to dig deeper, Michael stayed late, pretending to organize supplies. When the house grew quiet, he retrieved the vial and compared it to the official chart. As suspected, it wasn't listed. What was it? And why was it being administered to Hamilton? The answer, Michael realized, lay in the locked cabinet. That night, he scoured the mansion for a key, eventually finding one on a chain in Douglas's office. His heart raced as he returned to Hamilton's room and fit the key into the lock. Inside were rows of documents and files, including financial records detailing significant withdrawals from Hamilton's accounts, all authorized by Douglas. One document in particular caught Michael's eye. A letter referencing someone named Isabel, with instructions to ensure her permanent absence. Who was Isabel? A family member, perhaps? And why had she been removed? The name rang no bells, but the implications were chilling. Michael pocketed the letter and some of the financial records before carefully locking the cabinet and returning the key. He had enough to prove that something was amiss, but not enough to act. The following day brought fresh challenges. A new security guard appeared, shadowing Michael as he worked. Douglas, too, seemed more vigilant, his eyes lingering on Michael's every move. It was clear they suspected something. That evening, Michael's chance came. Douglas and the guard were occupied in the West Wing, leaving Hamilton's room unguarded. Michael returned to the locked cabinet, retrieving more documents, including a torn photograph of a younger Hamilton with a smiling woman. The back bore a date from 15 years prior, along with the name Isabel. Michael's stomach churned. Whoever she was, she had been important to Hamilton, and someone wanted her forgotten. As Michael pieced together the fragments of evidence, his resolve hardened. He had to confront someone, but who? Rosa might know something, but her fear made her an unreliable ally. Thomas, though distant, seemed observant. Michael decided to risk it. Late that night, he found Thomas smoking near the greenhouse. Approaching cautiously, Michael showed him the photograph and asked if he recognized the woman. Thomas's face darkened. "You should leave this alone," he said gruffly, but his trembling hand betrayed his fear. Isabel was Mr. Hamilton's daughter. She tried to fight Douglas, tried to stop him from whatever he's doing. They sent her away. A clinic somewhere. Nobody's seen her since. Michael's blood ran cold. The pieces fit. Isabel had been a threat to Douglas's control and had been eliminated, not physically, but effectively. If Isabel could be found, she could challenge Douglas's authority and protect Hamilton. But finding her would require more than whispers in the dark. The next morning, Michael faced Douglas in the dining hall. "What are you playing at?" Douglas snapped, his voice low but menacing. "You're here to do a job, not ask questions." Michael held his ground. "I'm here to care for Mr. Hamilton, and I'm not convinced he's being treated properly." Douglas's lips curled into a sneer. "You're overstepping, Nurse Carter. Watch yourself." That night, Michael made his boldest move yet. Using the documents he'd gathered, he contacted a trusted former colleague at a local hospital, asking them to investigate the clinic mentioned by Thomas. Within hours, he had a lead. Isabel was alive, but heavily medicated and confined to a private facility. The pieces were falling into place. Michael returned to the estate with renewed determination. Douglas confronted him in the hallway, flanked by the guard. "You've been snooping where you don't belong," Douglas hissed. "Hand over whatever you've taken." "No," Michael said firmly. "I know about Isabel. I know what you've done." The guard lunged, but Michael dodged, bolting toward Hamilton's room. He locked the door behind him and barricaded it with a chair. As the guard pounded outside, Michael turned to Hamilton, who stared at him with wide, desperate eyes. "I'll fix this," Michael whispered, injecting the antidote into the IV line. Slowly, Hamilton's breathing steadied. His lips moved, forming a single word: Douglas. The pounding grew louder, but Michael didn't falter. He gathered the documents and the photograph, ready to confront the family. When the door finally burst open, he stood his ground, holding the evidence aloft. "This ends now," he declared. "Douglas has been manipulating Mr. Hamilton's care, siphoning his money, and keeping his daughter away. I have proof." The family gasped as Michael laid the evidence on the table. Douglas tried to dismiss it as lies, but the weight of the documents was undeniable. By morning, the authorities had arrived, and Douglas was escorted out in handcuffs. Isabel's location was revealed, and plans were made to bring her home. As sunlight poured through the estate's grand windows, Michael sat by Hamilton's bedside, exhaustion etched into his features. The tycoon's fingers twitched, his eyes meeting Michael's with gratitude. For the first time in weeks, the mansion felt lighter, its dark secrets finally dragged into the light.